Sarah Thompson lived a quiet, simple life on her family's farm, nestled in the heart of Willow Creek. The farm had been in her family for generations, passed down from her grandparents to her parents, and finally to her after they passed away. It wasn't just a piece of land. It was home, filled with memories of laughter, hard work, and love. Every corner of the property held a story. The old oak tree where her father taught her to climb, the creaky barn where her mother helped her bottle feed baby goats, and the sprawling vegetable garden that always seemed to grow just a little better each year. Every morning, Sarah woke up before sunrise, sipping a cup of strong coffee as she watched the sky turn shades of pink and orange. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, she was already outside tending to her animals. Her chickens clucked happily around her feet as she scattered feed, and the goats bleated eagerly when they saw her carrying buckets of fresh water. She spent hours working in the fields, pulling weeds, planting seeds, or harvesting ripe tomatoes and cucumbers. It was backbreaking work, but it brought her joy. There was something magical about watching life sprout from the soil, knowing she played a part in nurturing it. Willow Creek Farm wasn't just functional, it was beautiful too. Wildflowers grew along the edges of the dirt driveway, swaying gently in the breeze. The farmhouse itself was charmingly rustic, with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch perfect for lazy afternoons. Sarah often sat there in the evenings, reading a book or knitting while listening to the soothing sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, chirping crickets, and distant hoots of owls. Life here was peaceful, far removed from the noise and stress of city living. But Sarah's world wasn't entirely isolated. She had good relationships with her neighbors, most of whom were older families who had lived in the area for decades. They shared tools, swapped recipes, and occasionally gathered for potluck dinners under the stars. Everyone looked out for one another, creating a tight-knit community that felt like an extended family. Sarah cherished these connections, especially since losing her parents. They reminded her that even though she ran the farm alone now, she wasn't truly by herself. Things began to change a few years ago when developers started buying up nearby properties. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. After all, progress happened everywhere, and she figured the new owners would blend into the fabric of the town. But then came the Homeowners Association, or HOA, a group formed by the newcomers to enforce strict rules about how properties should look and function. Fences had to be painted white, driveways paved, and lawns manicured to perfection. While some residents complied without complaint, others grumbled about the loss of freedom. Sarah shrugged off the HOA at first. Her farm predated their existence, and she assumed her historical exemption would protect her from their demands. Besides, Willow Creek wasn't exactly what anyone would call modern. The barn leaned slightly to one side. The driveway was still dirt, and the house definitely needed a fresh coat of paint. To Sarah, these imperfections added character. But as the months went by, whispers reached her ears, whispers that hinted trouble might be brewing. Little did she know, her quiet life was about to be turned upside down. The calm mornings, the happy animals, and the comforting routine she loved so much were soon going to face challenges bigger than anything she'd ever imagined. Yet deep down, Sarah was no stranger to hard work and determination. If pushed, she wouldn't back down easily. And unbeknownst to her, she had more allies than she realized, including someone very close to her who would step in when the stakes got higher. The standoff at Willow Creek Farm quickly became the talk of the town, and then some. News outlets picked up the story, and within hours, images of James confronting Richard went viral online. Reporters flocked to the small rural community, eager to uncover more about the HOA scandal. For Sarah, the sudden attention was overwhelming. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but she knew this was an opportunity to expose the truth, not just for her sake, but for everyone who had suffered under the HOA's iron grip. James wasted no time capitalizing on the media frenzy. Standing alongside Sarah on the porch of the farmhouse, he held a press conference that drew both local journalists and national reporters. With cameras rolling and microphones thrust toward him, James laid out the evidence he'd uncovered. Forged documents, bribes, and emails revealing Richard Grayson's plan to bulldoze family farms like Sarah's to make way for luxury estates. "This isn't just about one piece of land," James declared, his voice steady and authoritative. "It's about protecting our community from greed and corruption." As the story gained traction, public outrage grew. People were shocked by the lengths the HOA had gone to push out longtime residents. Protest signs popped up around town with slogans like "Save Our Farms" and "No More HOA Bullies." Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out now came forward, sharing their own stories of intimidation and harassment. One elderly couple tearfully recounted how they'd lost their home after refusing to pay exorbitant fines. A young family described how they'd been forced to sell their property because they couldn't afford renovations demanded by the HOA. Each story added fuel to the fire, turning what started as a personal battle into a full-blown movement. Richard Grayson found himself at the center of the storm. Once celebrated as a visionary developer, he was now vilified as a symbol of corporate greed. His attempts to defend himself fell flat. In interviews, he stammered and dodged questions, only digging himself deeper into trouble. When footage surfaced of him yelling at Sarah during the standoff, public opinion turned even further against him. Calls for investigations poured in, not only targeting Richard, but also the officials who had enabled his schemes. Local authorities launched a formal inquiry, and it didn't take long for cracks to appear in the foundation of the HOA's power. Several inspectors admitted to accepting bribes, while others resigned in disgrace. The county commissioner, who had greenlit many of Richard's projects, faced mounting pressure to step down. Even the police department came under scrutiny for allowing deputies to enforce evictions without proper oversight. It seemed everyone involved was scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. For Sarah, watching the dominoes fall was surreal. She never imagined her quiet life would spark such widespread change. But as satisfying as it was to see justice served, she couldn't help feeling conflicted. The fight had cost her sleepless nights, endless stress, and moments where she doubted whether she could keep going. Yet through it all, she discovered something unexpected: resilience. Facing adversity head-on had shown her just how strong she truly was. One evening, as the dust began to settle, Sarah sat on the porch with James, sipping tea and watching the sunset. "Do you think it's over?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Not entirely. There'll be hearings, lawsuits, probably months of legal wrangling. But the hardest part is behind us. You stood your ground when it mattered most." Sarah nodded, gazing out at the fields she loved so much. Despite everything, Willow Creek still felt like home. And now, thanks to her courage and James' unwavering support, it always would. As the sky turned shades of pink and gold, she allowed herself a small smile. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. When James Thompson arrived at Willow Creek Farm the next morning, Sarah barely recognized him. Gone was the laid-back brother who teased her about her hippie lifestyle and laughed at her stubborn streak. In his place stood a man with a sharp gaze and an air of authority that commanded respect. Dressed in his sheriff's uniform, complete with polished boots and a wide-brimmed hat, James looked every bit the protector he was sworn to be. But it wasn't just his appearance that had changed. It was the determination etched into his face. Sarah met him outside the farmhouse, where she'd been pacing nervously since dawn. The sight of her big brother stepping out of his patrol car brought tears to her eyes again. But this time, they were tears of relief. James didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He pulled her into a quick hug before getting straight to business. "Show me everything," he said firmly. "Every document, every letter, every photo you've got." For the next hour, Sarah walked him through the details of her ordeal. She handed over the certified letter from the HOA, the invoice listing absurd fines, and even the old property deeds proving her family's ownership of the land. James listened intently, jotting notes in a small notebook as he examined each piece of evidence. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. "This smells fishy," he muttered under his breath. "Something isn't right here." Turning to Sarah, he added, "Give me 2 days. I'll dig into this myself, check records, talk to people, see what I can find. Don't do anything until you hear from me, okay?" Sarah nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in her mind. Could James really take on the HOA? They seemed untouchable, their power bolstered by money and connections. But seeing the fire in her brother's eyes gave her hope. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. Over the next 48 hours, James worked tirelessly. He spent hours at the county courthouse combing through property records, searching for discrepancies or loopholes the HOA might have exploited. He spoke with local officials, some of whom admitted off the record that Richard Grayson had pressured them into siding with the HOA. One clerk even slipped James a copy of emails showing how Richard had bribed inspectors to falsify reports about Sarah's land being part of disputed territory. But perhaps the most damning discovery came when James visited neighboring farms. Many of the older residents confided in him, sharing stories of similar harassment from the HOA. Some had caved under pressure, selling their properties cheaply to avoid legal battles. Others had simply moved away, too tired to fight anymore. Hearing these accounts only fueled James' resolve. This wasn't just about Sarah. It was about protecting an entire community from greed and corruption. By the end of the second day, James had pieced together enough evidence to expose Richard's scheme. But he knew presenting it wouldn't be easy. The HOA had deep pockets and powerful allies, which meant they wouldn't go down without a fight. Still, James wasn't afraid of hard battles. He thrived on them. As he drove back to Willow Creek, his mind raced with plans for how to confront the situation head-on. When he returned to the farm, Sarah was sitting on the porch, staring blankly at the horizon. Her eyes lit up when she saw his truck pull in. "Did you find anything?" she asked anxiously as he climbed the steps. James smiled grimly, holding up a folder stuffed with documents. "Enough to make Richard regret ever messing with us," he replied. Then, with a reassuring squeeze of her shoulder, he added, "You're not alone in this, Sarah. We'll get through it, together." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a spark of confidence reignite within her. With James by her side, she knew they stood a fighting chance. But as they prepared for the battle ahead, neither of them realized just how far-reaching the consequences would be, not just for Sarah, but for everyone involved. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began to rebuild, not just her farm, but her faith in the community around her. The HOA scandal had left deep scars, not only for her but for many of her neighbors who had been bullied or forced out of their homes. Yet, amidst the fallout, something remarkable happened. People came together. What started as a fight to save Willow Creek Farm evolved into a movement to reclaim the spirit of the town. Sarah decided to open her farm to the community in ways she never had before. She hosted workshops on sustainable farming, teaching anyone interested how to grow vegetables, care for animals, and live off the land. On weekends, families gathered at Willow Creek to learn about composting, beekeeping, and even building chicken coops. Children ran through the fields, chasing goats and laughing as they helped collect eggs. For the first time in years, the farm buzzed with life, not just from its animals, but from the people who visited it. Word spread quickly, and soon Sarah's efforts caught the attention of local schools. Teachers brought students on field trips to Willow Creek, using the farm as an outdoor classroom. Kids learned where food came from, how plants grew, and why preserving farmland mattered. Sarah found joy in watching their eyes light up when they pulled carrots straight from the soil or held a baby chick for the first time. It reminded her of her own childhood, when her parents taught her the same lessons. The sense of unity extended beyond the farm. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started reaching out to one another. Some formed committees to advocate for fair housing policies, while others organized fundraisers to help displaced families return to their properties. A group of volunteers even rebuilt fences and painted barns for elderly residents who couldn't afford repairs after years of neglect under the HOA's strict and expensive Rules. James played a key role in fostering this renewed sense of connection. He attended town hall meetings, urging residents to hold developers accountable and ensure no one else would fall victim to schemes like Richard's. His reputation as a fair and fearless sheriff grew, earning him widespread respect. People often joked that having a sheriff in the family must be nice, but Sarah knew it wasn't just his badge that made James special, it was his heart. Even those who had initially supported the HOA began to see things differently. Many admitted they'd been misled by promises of modernization and higher property values, only to realize too late what they were losing in return. Slowly, attitudes shifted. Conversations became less divisive. Friendships rekindled, and old wounds began to heal. The divide between longtime residents and newcomers narrowed, replaced by a shared commitment to protecting their way of life. One crisp spring morning, Sarah stood on her porch, sipping coffee as she watched the sunrise. The air smelled of freshly turned earth and blooming wildflowers. Chickens scratched at the ground nearby, and the distant sound of children playing drifted across the fields. It was a scene she thought she might never experience again. But here she was, surrounded by beauty, laughter, and hope. She smiled as she spotted James pulling into the driveway. "What brings you here so early?" she teased as he climbed the steps. "I brought reinforcements," he replied, grinning. Behind him trailed a group of volunteers armed with shovels, paintbrushes, and tools. They'd come to help Sarah fix up the old barn, which had leaned precariously for far too long. As they set to work, laughter and chatter filled the air, blending with the sounds of hammers and saws. By evening, the barn was sturdy once more, its weathered wood freshly painted. Sarah looked at it proudly, knowing it symbolized more than just progress. It represented resilience, teamwork, and the power of standing together against injustice. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful about the future. Willow Creek wasn't just her home anymore. It was a beacon of hope for everyone who believed in fighting for what truly mattered. And Sarah knew, without a doubt, that she'd done exactly that. One crisp autumn morning, as Sarah was gathering eggs from the chicken coop, she noticed a white envelope sticking out of her mailbox. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough, just another bill or maybe a flyer for the local harvest festival. But when she flipped it over and saw the words "certified letter" stamped across the front, her stomach dropped. Something about the formal tone of those two words made her uneasy. She wiped her hands on her jeans and tore open the envelope, scanning the contents quickly. By the time she reached the bottom of the page, her heart was pounding. The letter was from the HOA, and it wasn't friendly. In fact, it was downright hostile. According to the document, Sarah had violated several community standards. Her unpaved driveway, a violation. The weathered barn that leaned ever so slightly to one side, another violation. Even the peeling paint on her farmhouse was listed as an eyesore that needed immediate attention. Worst of all, the letter claimed she owed $10,000 in fines for failing to comply with these rules, a staggering amount of money that might as well have been $1 million given her modest income. Sarah stared at the paper in disbelief, rereading it multiple times to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. How could this be happening? Willow Creek Farm had stood on this land long before the HOA even existed. Her grandparents had built the house and barn decades ago, and no one had ever complained about how things looked back then. What gave this group of strangers the right to dictate what she could or couldn't do with her own property? Determined to set things straight, Sarah decided to attend the next HOA meeting. She figured if she explained her situation face to face, they'd see reason. Surely, once they understood the history of her farm and the hard work she put into keeping it alive, they'd back off. Armed with documents proving her ownership and photographs of her family working the land over the years, Sarah walked into the community center where the meeting was being held. The room buzzed with chatter as neighbors greeted each other warmly. Or so it seemed until Sarah entered. Conversations stopped abruptly, and heads turned to look at her. For the first time, she felt like an outsider in her own town. At the head of the table sat Richard Grayson, the self-appointed president of the HOA. Dressed in an expensive suit, he exuded confidence and authority. When Sarah approached him after the meeting, he barely glanced up from his phone. "Miss Thompson," he said curtly, gesturing for her to sit. She laid out her case, explaining that her farm predated the HOA's existence and that its character was tied to its history. But Richard didn't seem interested. He dismissed her arguments with a wave of his hand, insisting that exceptions couldn't be made. "Rules are rules," he said coldly. "If you want to stay here, you'll need to follow them." His tone left no room for negotiation. Sarah tried to remain calm, but frustration bubbled inside her. Who was this man to tell her how to live on land that had been in her family for generations? She asked about the $10,000 fine, hoping there might be some mistake. Instead of offering clarification, Richard smirked and slid a detailed invoice across the table. Each line item broke down every supposed infraction, complete with dates and photos taken without her permission. It felt invasive, almost personal, as though they were targeting her specifically. As she left the meeting, Sarah's mind raced. She knew she couldn't afford to pay the fine, let alone renovate her entire property to meet their impossible standards. Yet giving up wasn't an option either. Willow Creek Farm wasn't just a place. It was her legacy. Every fence post, every blade of grass, and every animal roaming the fields represented years of dedication and love. Losing it would mean losing a piece of herself. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the letter again. Tears welled up in her eyes, not because she was afraid, but because she was angry. Angry at the injustice of it all. Angry at the way people like Richard thought they could bulldoze through lives without a second thought. Still, beneath the anger was a flicker of determination. If the HOA wanted a fight, she'd give them one. She just hoped she wouldn't have to face it alone. The morning of the third day arrived, and Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she watched the sun rise over Willow Creek. Time was running out. The eviction deadline loomed like a dark cloud, and despite James' reassurances, she couldn't shake the fear that the HOA would follow through on their threats. She tried to distract herself by feeding the animals and tidying up the house, but her hands trembled as she worked. Every sound, the creak of the barn door, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, made her heart race, expecting the worst. Just after noon, the crunch of tires on gravel signaled someone's arrival. Sarah froze, gripping the handle of her rake tightly as she turned toward the driveway. Her breath caught when she saw not one, but 3 police cars pulling up to her property. Each vehicle bore the county sheriff's emblem, but these weren't James' deputies. They were officers sent by the HOA, led by none other than Richard Grayson himself, who stepped out of the lead car with a smug grin plastered across his face. "Miss Thompson," Richard called out, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I trust you've had enough time to pack your things." Sarah clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Before she could respond, however, another set of headlights appeared at the edge of the property. A familiar black and white patrol car rolled in, blocking the path of the others. Out stepped James, tall and imposing in his uniform, flanked by 2 of his most trusted deputies. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the standoff. "What's going on here?" James demanded, his tone sharp and commanding. He strode forward, positioning himself between Sarah and Richard's group. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard faltered for a moment, clearly unprepared for James' intervention. Recovering quickly, he gestured toward the eviction notice in his hand. "Sheriff Thompson, I'm glad you're here to witness this. Your sister has been served a lawful order to vacate the premises due to violations of HOA regulations and disputed land claims. We're simply enforcing the law." James raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Is that so? Funny thing about laws, they tend to require proof." With that, he pulled out the folder he'd brought, flipping it open to reveal documents, photographs, and emails detailing Richard's underhanded tactics. "Care to explain why these records show you bribed inspectors and forged documents to claim this land is disputed? or how you pressured local officials to side with you. Richard's face flushed red, his confident demeanor crumbling under James' scrutiny. "Those are baseless accusations," he sputtered. "You can't just—" "I can," James interrupted, his voice cold and steady. "And I will. This land belongs to my sister, free and clear. These so-called violations are nonsense, and everyone here knows it." He turned to address the other officers, his gaze unwavering. "This eviction is invalid. If anyone tries to enforce it, they'll answer to me personally." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unwilling to challenge the county sheriff. One by one, they retreated to their vehicles, leaving Richard standing alone. His jaw tightened as he realized he'd been defeated for now. Without another word, he stormed back to his car and sped off, tires kicking up dust in his wake. As the tension eased, Sarah let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It's okay, sis," he said softly. "You're staying right here. No one's taking this farm away from you." Neighbors began to gather along the fence line, drawn by the commotion. Some clapped and cheered, while others whispered amongst themselves, realizing for the first time just how far the HOA had gone to push people out. Cameras flashed as reporters arrived, eager to capture the dramatic scene unfolding before them. For Sarah, the victory felt bittersweet. While she was relieved to keep her home, she knew the fight wasn't truly over yet. But as she looked around at the growing crowd of supporters, and at her brother standing steadfastly by her side, she found strength in knowing she wasn't facing it alone anymore. The days following the HOA meeting felt like a blur for Sarah. She spent hours poring over legal documents, trying to find anything that could protect her from their demands. Her nights were restless, filled with tossing and turning as she replayed Richard's smug expression in her mind. No matter how hard she tried to push back against the weight of the situation, it loomed over her like a storm cloud refusing to break. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became, but anger alone wouldn't solve her problems. Despite her growing frustration, Sarah refused to give up. She reached out to a local attorney, hoping he could offer some guidance. After reviewing her case, the lawyer confirmed what she already feared. While her farm technically predated the HOA, the organization had enough political influence to make things difficult. He warned her that fighting them would be an uphill battle, one that could drag on for months or even years. Worse still, if they decided to escalate matters, there was little she could do to stop them. Her worst fears came true just 2 weeks later. On a chilly November afternoon, as Sarah was stacking firewood near the barn, she heard the crunch of tires rolling down her dirt driveway. At first, she assumed it was one of her neighbors stopping by to check on her. But when she looked up and saw 2 police cars pulling into her yard, her stomach sank. 2 officers stepped out, their faces unreadable as they approached her. One held a clipboard, while the other carried an official-looking document. "Miss Thompson?" the taller officer asked, his voice calm but firm. Sarah nodded, clutching the axe she'd been using to split wood. "We're here to serve you with an eviction notice," he continued, holding out the paper. "You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." Sarah's heart raced. "Eviction? This is my land," she protested, shaking her head in disbelief. "I've lived here my entire life. My family built this farm." "I understand, Mom," the officer said sympathetically, though his tone made it clear he wasn't there to argue. "But according to our records, the HOA has filed a claim stating that your property is part of disputed land. Until the issue is resolved, we're required to enforce their request." Disputed land? Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. She knew Richard must have pulled strings behind the scenes to make this happen. How else could they justify kicking her off land that had been in her family for decades? Still, standing there arguing wouldn't change anything. With trembling hands, she accepted the notice, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. As the officers drove away, Sarah collapsed onto the porch steps, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in her life, she felt completely powerless. What was she supposed to do now? Pack up her animals, leave her home, and abandon everything she'd worked so hard to build? It didn't seem real, like something out of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. That's when she remembered James, her older brother. He was the sheriff of the county, a role he took seriously but handled with fairness and integrity. Though they didn't talk every day, their bond was unshakable. Growing up, James had always been her protector, the one who chased away bullies and stood by her side during tough times. If anyone could help her navigate this mess, it was him. With shaking fingers, Sarah dialed his number. When James answered, his deep, steady voice immediately calmed her nerves. "Hey, sis," he greeted warmly. "What's going on?" "James," she began, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "They're trying to kick me off the farm. The HOA sent cops to deliver an eviction notice. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a tone that was both reassuring and resolute, James replied, "Don't worry, Sarah. I'll take care of this. Just breathe. You're not losing Willow Creek. Not on my watch." His words brought a flicker of hope back into Sarah's heart. For the first time since receiving the eviction notice, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things might turn out okay. But as she hung up the phone and glanced around at the fields she loved so much, she couldn't shake the fear that the fight ahead would test her. And James, in ways neither of them could predict. Months had passed since the dramatic standoff at Willow Creek Farm, and life in the small rural town had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The HOA scandal became a turning point, not just for Sarah, but for the entire community. Where there had once been division and fear, there was now unity and purpose. The fight to save Willow Creek Farm had ignited something powerful, a shared determination to protect their way of life from greed and corruption. Sarah stood on her porch one golden autumn afternoon, watching the field sway gently in the breeze. The farm looked better than ever. The barn gleamed with fresh paint. The driveway, still unpaved, was lined with wildflowers, and her vegetable garden overflowed with pumpkins, squash, and kale. Chickens pecked happily at the ground, while goats lounged lazily under the shade of the old oak tree. It wasn't perfect by city standards, but it was alive with character and charm, the kind that couldn't be bought or manufactured. The scars of the past year hadn't completely faded, but they no longer weighed her down. Instead, they reminded her of how far she'd come. She thought about the nights she'd spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd lose everything. Now, standing here surrounded by abundance, she felt grateful, not just for her farm, but for the people who had stood by her side. James visited often, teasing her about becoming a local celebrity. "You're like the queen of Willow Creek now," he'd say with a wink. And in some ways, he wasn't wrong. The movement sparked by Sarah's battle continued to grow. Neighbors formed alliances to push back against developers eyeing their land. Town meetings were lively and productive, filled with passionate discussions about preserving history while embracing progress. Even former HOA members joined the cause, ashamed of their role in Richard Grayson's schemes. Together, they drafted new regulations that balanced growth with respect for the community's roots. Richard himself disappeared from public view after the investigations concluded. Fines and lawsuits stripped him of much of his wealth, and his reputation lay in ruins. Some whispered he'd moved out of state, seeking anonymity. Others didn't care where he went. They were simply glad he was gone. For Sarah, his downfall wasn't the victory she cherished most. What mattered was seeing her neighbors stand tall, refusing to let fear dictate their lives anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah hosted a harvest dinner at the farm. Long tables stretched across the yard, laden with food grown right there on the property. Roasted vegetables, homemade bread, jars of pickles and pies made from apples picked off the trees near the creek. Lanterns hung from the branches of the oak tree, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Friends, family, and neighbors mingled, laughing and sharing stories late into the night. James raised a glass during dessert, calling for everyone's attention. "To my sister," he said, his voice ringing out clear and proud. "She didn't just save this farm. She reminded us all what it means to stand up for what's right. To courage, resilience, and community." Cheers erupted, and Sarah blushed, waving off the praise. But deep down, she knew he was right. This wasn't just her story. It belonged to everyone who had fought alongside her. Each person had played a part, whether by speaking out, lending a hand, or simply showing up when it mattered most. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah lingered outside, staring up at the stars. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney. She thought about her parents and grandparents, imagining them looking down with pride. They had worked hard to build this place, and she had honored their legacy by fighting to keep it alive. In that moment, Sarah realized something profound. The true strength of Willow Creek Farm wasn't in its soil or structures. It was in the love and connection it inspired. It was a sanctuary not just for her, but for anyone who needed a reminder of simpler times, honest work, and the beauty of nature. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew she'd face them with the same grit and grace that had carried her through this storm. Life would never be without its struggles, but Sarah welcomed them. After all, it was through adversity that she discovered her own resilience and learned just how much she could accomplish when she leaned on those who cared about her. As she turned to head inside, she smiled softly, feeling a deep sense of peace. Willow Creek Farm wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And so was she.